It's 6:12 in the morning, and you're lying in the dark, staring at a ceiling fan you've stared at every morning for the last 6 years. Except this morning it looks different, because you haven't slept. Because somewhere around 2 a.m. you gave up trying and just lay there running the same 6 numbers through your head until they stopped looking like numbers and started looking like a sentence you couldn't finish reading. The confirmation email from the State Lottery Commission is still open on your phone. Screen dimmed but not dark. Sitting on the nightstand where you left it 4 hours ago after the 3rd time you checked, it wasn't a phishing scam. $600 million. You say it out loud to the empty room, quietly, the way you'd test whether a word still means anything after repeating it too many times. Your alarm goes off at 6:30 anyway, because some part of you that hasn't caught up yet still thinks you have a shift at the distribution center this afternoon. You silence it and sit on the edge of the bed for a long moment, feet flat on the cold floor, and you notice your hands are shaking slightly. Not from fear exactly, more like the aftershock of adrenaline that hasn't found anywhere to go yet. You make coffee the way you always do, and it's while you're standing at the counter watching the machine sputter that the full weight of it arrives. Not as excitement, but as a low, specific dread. You don't know what to do next. Nobody teaches you what to do next. By 8:15, you're in the car, driving toward downtown with the ticket sealed inside a sandwich bag in your jacket pocket, because somewhere in your sleepless scrolling last night, you read that fingerprints and sun damage can void a claim, and you're not taking chances with a piece of paper currently worth more than every house on your street combined. You've called exactly one person before leaving, an attorney named Vanessa Okafor, whose name you found on a lottery winners forum at 3 a.m. under a thread titled, "Do this before you tell anyone." Her assistant answered on the second ring, which told you she gets calls like this more often than her modest office building would suggest. Her office sits on the 6th floor above a dry cleaner, nothing like the marble and glass version you'd imagined. She's younger than you expected, maybe 40, with the unhurried calm of someone who has already seen every version of the conversation you're about to have. She doesn't ask why you're there. She just gestures to the chair across from her desk and says, "Don't sign the back of that ticket yet. You almost had twice, out of some instinct to make it official." She explains that signing it makes it legally yours the moment anyone photographs it, and once your name is attached, there's no version of privacy left to build. Instead, she slides a folder toward you containing something you didn't know existed 20 minutes ago. A blind trust structure, drafted that morning based on the phone call, ready for your signature. "We name it something forgettable," she says. "Something that means nothing to anyone searching for you." You think for a second and land on Thistlewood Holdings, after a street you lived on as a kid that no longer exists on current maps. She nods like it's a fine choice, because to her, every choice at this stage is really the same choice: distance. "Here's the part people don't think about," she says, turning her laptop toward you. "The 600 million on the billboard isn't a real number. It's the annuity total, paid out over 30 years. If you want it now, in one payment, the cash value is what the state actually holds today. And that's a very different figure." She pulls up the estimate. $328 million. You feel your stomach do something complicated, watching nearly half the number you fell asleep, repeating disappear before you've signed a single form. "That's before taxes," she adds, in the tone of someone delivering test results that are serious but survivable. By 10 a.m., you're sitting in a windowless back room of the regional claims office, across from a woman named Odalise Ferreira, who has clearly done this enough times that her calm isn't performance, it's muscle memory. She asks lump, sum, or annuity, and you already know, because Vanessa walked you through it in the elevator on the way over. The annuity sounds safer on paper, 30 guaranteed payments, but it's really the state paying you slowly instead of paying you what the money is worth today, spread out in a way that assumes you'll still want it exactly the same in year 29 as you do this morning. You take the lump sum. Speed, even discounted, feels like the only version of this you can actually hold on to. Odalise processes the claim through Thistlewood Holdings, and for the first time all morning, your own legal name doesn't appear anywhere on the paperwork. It's a strange feeling, watching your identity get quietly folded away like something you're not allowed to bring inside anymore. At noon, you're sitting across from a CPA named Elliot Cho, recommended by Vanessa, in an office that smells like fresh paint. He has a calculator he barely uses because he's already done this math 100 times in his head. 24% goes to federal withholding automatically, he says. That happens today, the second the trust claims the prize. No negotiating. On 328 million, that's just under 79 million gone before lunch. But he's careful to tell you, in the same even voice he probably reserves for worse news, that 24% is only a deposit. A win this size pushes you into the top federal bracket, 37%. And the rest comes due the following spring, another 42 million or so, waiting quietly, already spent in the government's mind, even though you haven't touched it yet. There's one piece of relief tucked into the wreckage. Your state charges no additional tax on lottery winnings, so whatever the IRS doesn't take, you actually keep. After everything settles, the number that's genuinely, finally yours lands at $207 million. It doesn't feel like winning. It feels like watching a number get whittled down by people who all seem to know something you don't. Your phone buzzes on the desk. A text from a name you haven't seen in 9 years. Theo Marsh, a guy you sat next to in a high school chemistry class and never spoke to again after graduation. Hey, stranger! Long time, no, see, how have you been? You stare at it for a second, confused, until you remember that your win hasn't been publicly announced anywhere, which means Theo texting you today, of all days, on pure, unprompted nostalgia, is either an extraordinary coincidence or a sign that someone at the claims office already talks too much. Elliot notices your face and doesn't even ask what happened. Word moves fast in small systems, he says. Get used to that. By 2 p.m., you're sitting in a diner 3 blocks from Elliot's office, needing 10 minutes that don't involve paperwork, when your sister Priyanka calls. You almost don't answer, still rattled by the Theo text, but it's your sister, so you do. She sounds normal at first, asking about dinner plans for the weekend, mentioning her cars, making a noise again. And it's such an ordinary conversation that for a moment you forget what's sitting in a trust with your grandmother's old street name attached to it. Then, almost as an afterthought, she mentions that her landlord raised the rent again, that she's thinking about picking up weekend shifts, and you hear yourself say, before you've decided to say it, that you might be able to help. She goes quiet. Help how? She asks, and you realize you've just opened a door you weren't ready to open. Not because you don't want to help her. You do, immediately, without hesitation. But because you haven't figured out yet how to help one person without the entire family finding out within a week. You tell her you'll call her tonight, that you're in the middle of something. She doesn't push. That, more than anything else today, tells you something important about her. At 3:30, your cousin Baxter calls, and this is a very different kind of call. Baxter has never once phoned you in 9 years without a reason attached to the front of it, and today is no exception. He heard from someone who heard from someone. He says, laughing in a way that doesn't quite land, that you hit it big. He wants to know if it's true. You don't confirm anything specific, but your silence apparently answers enough, because within 30 seconds, he's already pitching you an idea. A food truck franchise he's wanted to start for 2 years, just needs seed money, could pay you back within 18 months, easy. You tell him you need time to think, and he says, sure, no pressure, in a tone that suggests there is, in fact, considerable pressure. You hang up and sit with the ticket in your pocket, and Vanessa's voice comes back to you from that morning. Every name you tell is a point of failure. You didn't understand what she meant until just now, hearing your own cousin's voice shift from casual to calculated in under a minute. At 4:15, a private banker named Ronaldo Cabrera meets you at a downtown branch you've walked past 100 times without ever going inside. He's polished in a way that makes you feel slightly underdressed in your own jacket, and he walks you through what wealth management actually means at this scale. Not a single account, but a structure. A portion into low-cost index funds, boring by design, the same instrument every financial advisor recommends and almost nobody actually buys. A portion into municipal bonds for stability. A smaller portion, maybe 8%, set aside as genuinely liquid cash you can access without selling anything. Because Ronaldo tells you, plainly, that most sudden wealth disasters happen not because people don't have money, but because they don't have accessible money. They own things that are worth a fortune on paper and can't produce 6 figures in an emergency without a 30-day process attached to it. He also mentions, almost casually, something that lodges itself in your chest for the rest of the day. Opportunity cost. Every dollar you spend today on something that depreciates, a car, a watch, a boat, is a dollar that will never compound for you again. It's not a moral lecture, just arithmetic. $1 invested today at a reasonable long-term return roughly doubles every decade. $1 spent today is simply gone. He isn't telling you not to spend anything. He's telling you to notice the difference between spending and disappearing. At 5:40, still buzzing from the meeting, you drive past a dealership you've slowed down in front of for years without ever going in, and today, for the first time, you actually pull into the lot. A salesman named Duval greets you before you've even opened the car door, and within 4 minutes, you're sitting inside a matte black SUV that costs more than your entire childhood home, engine running, leather smelling like something out of a different life. Duval is good at his job. He talks about financing terms you don't need, about how a car like this says something the second you pull up anywhere. For about 90 seconds, you almost sign. Then you think about Ronaldo's voice from an hour earlier, about the dollar that stops compounding the second you spend it. And you think about the 600 million on the billboard that had already shrunk to 207 million before lunch. And you realize you're sitting in a car showroom 2 hours after learning exactly how fast large numbers disappear, about to make them disappear faster, on purpose. You tell Duval you need to think about it. He hands you a card with obvious disappointment, and you drive away in your own car, older, quieter, and somehow the first decision all day that actually feels like yours. By 7 p.m., you're back home, and your phone hasn't stopped buzzing since the diner. Messages from numbers you don't recognize, from a group chat you left 3 years ago that's suddenly active again, from an old coworker asking if you want to catch up soon. You mute the phone for the first time all day and sit in the quiet, and it's in that quiet that a text arrives from someone different. Marisol, a friend from your old apartment complex who you haven't spoken to in months. Not because anything went wrong, just because life got busy. Hey, no reason, just thought of you today. Hope you're doing okay. No mention of the news, because she doesn't know yet. No ask attached to it. Just a person checking in on a Tuesday for no reason at all. You sit with that message longer than you sat with any of the financial documents today. You realize, quietly, that you've spent the entire day being able to tell, almost instantly, the difference between people reaching toward you and people reaching for what's now attached to you. And Marisol's text is the first one all day that doesn't ask you for anything at all. At 8:30, you call your sister back, the way you promised. This time you tell her everything. Not the exact number, not yet, but enough. That you won, that it's real, that you're figuring out how to help without it becoming a headline in the family group chat by morning. She's quiet for a long moment, and then she says something that surprises you. You don't have to fix everything tonight. It's such a small sentence, but it's the first thing anyone has said to you all day that didn't come with an angle attached to it, and you feel something in your chest loosen slightly for the first time since 6:12 this morning. You tell her about the rent. You tell her you'll cover it, quietly, through the trust, structured the way Vanessa explained. No headline, no announcement, just a problem that stops existing without anyone needing to know why. She doesn't argue. She doesn't ask for more than what you offered. That, more than the 207 million sitting in an account somewhere with a made-up street name attached, feels like the only real proof today that something in your life is still exactly what it was yesterday. By 10 p.m., you're back at your kitchen table, the same one you sat at 4 years ago, filling out unemployment paperwork during a slow stretch between jobs, and it strikes you that the room looks exactly the same, water stain on the ceiling and all, even though nothing about your life technically is. You open your laptop and look at the numbers Ronaldo sent over. The index fund allocation, the bond ladder, the small reserved slice of liquid cash. And for the first time all day, instead of feeling like the money is happening to you, it starts to feel like something you're actually steering. You think about Baxter's food truck pitch, about Theo's out-of-nowhere text, about the SUV you almost signed for out of nothing but adrenaline and a stranger's well-rehearsed pitch. You think about how none of those moments were really about money at all. They were about attention, about being seen differently within hours of a number nobody was even supposed to know yet. And you think about Marisol's 4-word message, the only thing today that arrived with nothing attached. You don't sign anything else tonight. You don't call Baxter back. You send your sister a message confirming the rent is handled, and she replies with a single heart, nothing more, and somehow that's the message you reread twice before setting the phone down. At 11:47 p.m., lying in the same bed you woke up in 18 hours ago, staring at the same ceiling fan, You realize the day didn't teach you how to be rich. Nobody explained that today. Not Vanessa, not Elliot, not Ronaldo. What today actually taught you, in fragments scattered across a single Tuesday, is how fast the people and things around you start rearranging themselves the instant they sense a number attached to your name. How quickly some relationships reveal themselves as transactions you never agreed to, and how rare it is, in the space of one long day, to find a single message that wants nothing back. You still don't know what tomorrow looks like. You don't know what you'll say to Baxter, or whether Theo will text again once the news becomes official, or how long you can keep answering fine, just busy to people who have no idea what busy has actually meant today. But you know one thing clearly now, more clearly than you understood it at 6:12 this morning, staring at a confirmation email you were half convinced was fake. The money changed by the hour today. $328 million by 10 a.m., $207 million by noon, a little less by dinner once you factored in what Ronaldo called the cost of doing this properly. But the people around you changed by the minute, and that, you're starting to understand, is the part no financial advisor puts in the paperwork. Somewhere between the claims office and the kitchen table, you stopped asking how much you'd won and started quietly counting how many people, out of everyone who reached out today, actually reached for you. You fall asleep before you finish counting.